The first question we wanted to ask you was about homogeneous skylines, or the risk of creating skylines that look the same from city to city or country to country. What steps should cities be taking? What steps are you taking or interested in?
Great question. And we, as I just presented actually, we think about the role of each building and the role that each building has on the skyline, not only at 150 meters, but also at grade. And I don't think that every building is a landmark building, and I don't think that every building should be a gateway building. So we try very hard to make sure that our skyline, if you will, is well composed. So those key projects or those key sites that warrant taller buildings should have more exuberant tops. But not every building should. And not that I'm critical of cities that do have every building screaming for and competing for attention. But it's just not us. It's just not Toronto. And actually, I'm quite pleased to say that USA today just announced results of their Reader's Choice survey last week that talked about top international skylines, where Toronto ranked number 4th. So I think we're doing a few things right. One of the things that helps us, of course, is we have our landmark CN Tower. That certainly gives our skyline some distinction, and it's coupled by the Rogers Centre, which I still call the Sky Dome, which is our stadium. So the two of those will actually give Toronto a unique signature, and the other buildings I think will also help contribute to that. You know, the vast pace of construction that we've seen over the past decade or so. You know, right now we have about 180 cranes in the air. So thinking about what has happened over the past decade, thinking about the rigor that we look at each single application and the community process that we take it through is something that I think is very helpful.
What sort of steps are you taking to ensure affordable housing? Or if you want to take it more generally, how do you think cities should be ensuring affordable housing? Is a tall building design a part of this?
Yeah, there's a range of affordability, and there's a range of sites and how we approach affordability. So certainly if land is owned by the city, then we can govern and mandate that a certain percentage of the units that are constructed, say 20%, is something that should be affordable housing. That's lands that we are in ownership, for example, on the waterfront. There are also varying degrees of affordability. Less than market, of course, is one degree of affordability, and then the other one is rent geared to income. So certainly on sites that we are redeveloping, like a housing project called Regent Park, we have a lot more of rent geared to income. Now, on the general sense, the market also dictates, and one of the great things about Toronto is that the mid-market condominium is still affordable. You can buy a mid-market condominium for the equivalent of US $250,000. And they become great starter homes for families or for individuals. And one of the nice things about that is that it actually builds up equity for a young person so that they can actually own their own home. And when you're actually owning your own home in a condominium, that property is actually going to be much better maintained because there's a condo board, and their interest is to make sure that the upkeep of that property is one that represents the unit owners, because it's their own value that they're protecting. So I think home ownership is a good thing, and I think the fact that we have good mid-market prices still in the city is something that promotes that, and also promotes homeowner affordability. You know, a kilometer out of downtown Toronto, you could still buy a single-family home. Might cost you $1 million US. And that's where I think the starter condominium comes into play. I think it goes to creating healthy cities.
That's interesting. If you could select a major tall building design, construction, operation, management, research topic that you think needed more work, what would it be and why?
Well, certainly something that I'm interested in getting involved with in my tenure here at the Council on Tall Buildings and Urban Habitat is that urban habitat aspect of it. And certainly how buildings meet the street and what their role is, not just in the city, but also in terms of quality of life. You know, one of the things that we typically rank very high on surveys, regardless of whether it's Forbes or CNN or The Economist, is Toronto always ranks in the top 10 cities in the world livability, and that's certainly at the foundation of how we plan the city, something that we never forget about. Of course, planning is one aspect of that. Stability of government and healthcare are all things that help that rank. Climate is one of the things that help that rank. But it's something that's always in the back of our mind as we plan the city. So thinking about how buildings meet the street, thinking about the urban design aspects, which is certainly my expertise, is something that I'm actually quite happy to and willing to bring to the council as an addition to the realm of expertise that exists.
Yeah, speaking of public space or the public realm, tell us about the POPs program.
We've added 1 million square feet to the downtown in the past 10 years of privately owned public space, and that's what the acronym stands for. And council just recently branded our logo, but it's something that now we hope to see on a number of these spaces, and they all have different personalities. I think it contributes to the flavor of our city. You know, we have spaces that are rose gardens. We have spaces that are pedestrian connections that align with heritage buildings so that we can preserve and focus on and emphasize our heritage properties, even though they're becoming overshadowed with tall buildings. We have spaces that 20,000 people can gather in and watch a Leafs game on a big screen TV, spaces that are contributed by 3 or 4 projects, because that's what Canadians do when it's minus 10, is that they actually would watch a Leafs game outside. But it actually contributes to urban life, I think, and that's one of our goals, especially in the urban areas.
Yeah, just tell us briefly how it works. These are privately owned spaces?
That's right, and I often say it's a win-win, right? Often how it works is through discussions and negotiations with a developer. These spaces are sought by ourselves, and often are achieved through extra height. So the developer gets extra height through the process. Of course, a condominium on the 50th floor is worth more than that same unit with the same finishes and same kitchen on the 25th floor, because height, as heights increase, so does the revenues that a developer is able to get. And we don't think about these in the carte blanche way that they did in the 1960s in New York, where you get a plaza and you get a density bonus. That was great for the first one, and Seagram's is still one of my favorite spaces in New York. But when the second one had an open space, and a third one had the same open space or the same plaza, then you get a monotonous streetscape, and you defeat the purpose of having the first open space. So we are actually quite clever, I think, in targeting these open spaces. What is needed? First of all, is an open space needed on a block? And if so, then what type of open space? Is it a plaza? Is it a parkette? Is it a pedestrian connection linking 2 parks? And thinking about also the park network that exists in the public realm. And in many cases, of course, we don't think that an open space is important on a site. If it has, for example, heritage on that site, we want to make sure that we preserve that heritage fabric. But if we do think there are opportunities, then we have a number of ways and discussions in which we can achieve that. And we're quite proactive in city planning and urban design. We're quite proactive in doing drawings and illustrations. I have 6 colleagues that I work with in Toronto and East York that are all architects. And that's, I think, important, so that we can complement our colleagues in planning to actually visualize the spaces that we think are important.
So Toronto's, as you alluded to earlier, now one of the tall building hotbeds of the world.
Yeah.
A relatively recent phenomenon, at least in terms of how much it's ramped up, is the Manhattanization, as some people have called it, of Toronto, a positive trend?
You know, absolutely. I think it's a positive trend, but we do have to be careful. And there are some distinctions between us and Manhattan, but I think the general idea is a good one. You know, I went to school at Columbia University, so Manhattanization is a very affectionate term for me that's near and dear. But one of the things that we're trying to put in place today, and it goes back to that top 10 quality of life that people say that we have, is to make sure that we achieve that long term. And part of that is we've written tall building guidelines that talk about how towers should be spaced. If you look at Manhattan, if you look at some of those key or golden apartments that were built in the 60s with a sea of greenery around them, not perhaps the stuff that urban designers like to see, but the value of those units are actually well maintained because they know in perpetuity that they will have that breathing room behind them. So that's what we're trying to do with our point towers that we see in Toronto. We still have a podium that reinforces the street and goes lot line to lot line. But then above that, we do want towers to be slim, they can be taller, but to have that quality of life in that breathing room so that one knows that you will not be staring at a blank wall. That, I think, also protects your investment if you're a purchaser. And what we're not trying to do is we're not trying to protect views from a picturesque point of view. You know, we have this world's tallest structure for many years, the CN Tower, and we're not trying to preserve people's views of that. What we're trying to do is to maintain an adequate view of light and privacy between tall buildings.
Mm-hmm. At the same time as you've seen this Manhattanization, this densification, there's been a flare-up of kind of an anti-urban sentiment in the area, and there's been continued sprawl, suburban development. Have you noticed this division getting worse, and how would you reconcile this division, which to some extent exists in every city, this push and pull between suburbs and urban density?
Yeah, no, I think that we are finding the right balance, and it actually is occurring by very many different levels of government. We have the provincial government, like your state governments, that have put a green belt around the greater area of Toronto, and that has actually helped stop the sprawl, largely in areas that are outside of our jurisdiction, the neighboring suburbs. But that puts the first ring around it. And then our official plan speaks to targeting growth in only 25% of the city of Toronto. Because we, like Chicago, have a lot of single-family neighborhoods, and we value those neighborhoods. And so obviously we're not targeting growth there. So it gives us a limited amount of area that we can grow. The downtowns, we have other centers, we have 4 other centers, and we have avenues. The avenues will have transit on them. So again, linking infrastructure, transit, and targeted growth, I think, certainly makes sense. You know, a presenter yesterday from Brazil said something that I found quite alarming, and it said that he would drive to work and it would take him an hour and 20 minutes. And on the weekend, it would take him 10 minutes. So I think that those are important lessons for us to, as planners, to take away from this conference and make sure that we think about those sorts of lessons in terms of making sure that the growth and infrastructure complement each other.
What steps has Toronto taken to promote the sensible proliferation of tall buildings that add to rather than detract from their environment?
Well, I think one of the things that is very beneficial is the process that we have in the planning department, where we actually look at every major application and take it to a community-based process. Either have at least 2 community meetings or even strike a working group. You know, I certainly value the relationships that we have with the major developers in our city, and I value the relationships that we have with council and with key members of the community stakeholders. It's always important to get their feedback, and I think it's actually quite rewarding to see what comes out of that process, and it's always something that's different. And that, I think, helps us fine-tune new development to a specific site. Now, we, of course, also plan broader than that. We have an official plan that sets out where tall buildings go, and then on larger master plans, we will work proactively to actually master plan an area, to mandate where the parks will go, where the roads will go, where the schools will go, where the daycares go.
I wanted to ask kind of a personal interest of mine, but I think it relates to a lot of stuff we've been talking about. Toronto is a part of the Great Lakes and St. Lawrence Cities Initiative, I believe. How does being part of the Great Lakes region affect your urban experience and your plans for expanding it and enhancing it?
Well, I think that certainly we value Lake Ontario, which we front on as our main front door. And from a residential perspective, you can certainly imagine how views to the lake are important for developers. We have a number of ways that we take advantage of the lake. Take advantage is perhaps not the right word, but you know, deep lake cooling that we brought into the downtown, I think, is an interesting, from a sustainability perspective, an interesting way of harvesting, if you will, not taking advantage, but harvesting the lake and its energy. You know, the lake is very much our amenity. We have an island, which is our central park. We want to think about ways in which we can bring more people from Toronto to use that island. Right now there's a ferry. Thinking about imaginative things like a harbor ring walk, as I brand it, an idea of a walkway that actually connects our inner harbor, very much like Marina Bay in Singapore has done. So these are, I think, the ways that you know, we'd like to take advantage of the lake, and the lake is certainly, you know, being part of the Great Lakes system is something that we're quite cognizant of.
Anything we haven't brought up that you'd like to talk about?
Well, I'm just delighted to. I hope that you see the ideas that we have, and hoping that we can bring some of these ideas to help not just our city, but also cities in general, because I think we're all driven here by making cities a better place. And we all are in agreement that tall building and the roles that tall buildings have very much contributes to making the cities more sustainable and bringing a higher quality of life to cities in general. We know that we cannot continue to sprawl indefinitely, and that's something that we've heard quite typically at the conference. So how do we do that well? Right. How do we intersperse tall buildings, whether it's in Toronto or Chicago or Mumbai or Sao Paulo? How do we do that as best as we can so that we can improve the quality of life for people around the world?
Yeah, the green belt you mentioned is a great step, but then people might leapfrog it too. There ends up being development outside of the green belt as well. So any other steps?
Has not happened, I think, because the green belt is of a size that it looks like it's a long way to traverse that green belt. So I think so far it's been quite contained. But when you do traverse it, then we're getting satellite smaller towns that are developing with their own unique infrastructure, their own little mini downtowns, their own access to commuter lines and transit, so that they themselves become sustainable communities because they're so far out that you're forced to do that.